In the imagination of most people today, medieval Europe is often painted as a place of strict morality, religious devotion, and rigid rules of daily life. Yet hidden beneath the surface of castles, cathedrals, and bustling markets was a world of laws that today sound not only strange, but sometimes absurd. Among the most curious of these were regulations about intimacy and the human body. To the lawmakers and priests of the time, controlling people's private behavior was not only about morality, but also about order, inheritance, and the power of the church. What resulted was a patchwork of rules that make modern readers shake their heads in disbelief. One of the earliest and most persistent concerns in Europe was the idea of modesty. Many cities, particularly in the late Middle Ages, passed laws against public bathing between men and women. Public bathhouses had once been places for relaxation, community, and even business meetings. But by the 14th century, anxiety about sin and temptation led authorities to crack down. Couples who were found bathing together could be fined, and in some cases, even exiled from their town. The bathhouse, once a center of health and hygiene, was rebranded as a place of danger. There were even rules in parts of England that required people to wear underclothes when outside their homes. To modern ears, this sounds obvious, but in a society where undergarments were not always common, it was actually a burden. Walking through the street without the proper layer could be seen as an offense against public decency. Authorities used these laws as a way to punish not only those who were considered immodest, but also the poor, who could not always afford the extra garments. Thus, the law about underwear became a tool for social control disguised as morality. The obsession with outward modesty masked a deeper fear that people's desires, if left unchecked, would threaten the social and religious order. By setting rules about who could bathe, what one must wear, and how the body should appear in public, rulers and clerics believed they were guarding not just virtue, but the very stability of their communities. In practice, these laws often created fear, humiliation, and inequality. Another strange law that appeared in stories across Europe was the so-called rite of the first night, sometimes called droit du seigneur. According to legend, lords or noblemen had the legal right to spend the first night with a newly married bride before her husband. To the modern reader, this idea sounds shocking and brutal, as if power could reach even into the most private moment of marriage. But historians debate whether it was ever truly practiced. Some believe it was more myth than reality, used later as propaganda to make medieval nobles look cruel and oppressive. Others suggest that while it may not have been an official written law, there were cases where powerful men forced such customs onto their subjects. Even if it was never formally written into legal codes, the very fact that this belief was widespread reveals something important about medieval society. People lived with a constant fear that their private lives were not their own. The church claimed authority over morality. The crown claimed authority over inheritance and property, and local lords claimed authority over the bodies of their peasants. The myth of the first night law may have been exaggerated, but it symbolized the deep inequality of power. Imagine the tension in a small village where such rumors spread. Every wedding could carry with it a shadow of dread. The bride, dressed for her ceremony, might be celebrated by her neighbors, while also whispering about whether the Lord would appear at her door. For the groom, his honor and masculinity could be publicly questioned if he failed to defend his new wife from intrusion. These anxieties, whether based in fact or in fear, added layers of pressure to what should have been a day of joy. Today, historians often point out that stories about the first night law were later revived during times of political upheaval. Writers in the Renaissance and Enlightenment used it as an example of the corruption of feudalism, a way to stir anger against the old aristocracy. True or not, it shows how ideas about sexual control were deeply tied to politics, propaganda, and social order. Among the most unusual regulations were those concerning the positions and behaviors allowed between husband and wife. The medieval church, especially from the 12th century onward, developed a strong voice in telling couples what was considered acceptable. Only one position was declared truly natural, because it was thought to reflect divine order, the man on top facing the woman. This was sometimes even called the missionary style, meant to emphasize reproduction rather than pleasure. Any other arrangement was condemned as unnatural, sinful, or even linked to demonic influence. Clergy wrote long lists of warnings about what should not be done in the marriage bed. These writings were not simply moral advice, but could also influence real punishments. In some regions, couples accused of using improper behavior could be summoned to confess to a priest, or even face legal penalties if the accusations reached civic authorities. To modern eyes, such laws seem invasive, as if strangers were invited into the most private corner of a marriage. The fear behind these restrictions was rooted in the belief that desire itself was dangerous unless tightly controlled. Pleasure for its own sake was condemned, while intimacy was only tolerated if it served reproduction. This reflected a wider worldview where the body was often treated with suspicion, while the soul and its purity were the true focus of life. The irony, of course, is that such rigid control often created more anxiety than virtue. Couples could live with constant fear that the wrong gesture, the wrong act, or even the wrong thought might be counted as sin. Yet even within these harsh boundaries, people were inventive. Manuals for confessors reveal that priests were frequently confronted with questions from parishioners about what was allowed and what was forbidden. The very existence of these questions shows that people did not always accept the rules quietly. Instead, they pushed against the limits, sometimes obeying only outwardly, while continuing their private lives behind closed doors. Religion shaped not only how intimacy was practiced, but also when it was permitted. In many parts of medieval Europe, there were strict bans on relations during holy days. At first, these restrictions were tied to major feasts such as Christmas or Easter. Over time, however, the list expanded until nearly half the calendar was considered off-limits. Wednesdays and Fridays were often marked as days of abstinence. Sundays were sacred, and the long weeks of Lent or Advent were also forbidden. Add in the feast days of saints, and couples could find themselves with fewer allowed days and prohibited ones. Breaking these rules was considered more than just a private offense. It was treated as a form of sacrilege, an insult to God that could bring spiritual danger to the entire household. Clergy warned that children conceived on forbidden days might be cursed, weak, or marked by misfortune. While these beliefs had no scientific basis, they carried enormous weight in a world where almost every misfortune could be explained as divine punishment. For ordinary people, these restrictions must have been exhausting. Imagine a young couple, newly married, carefully marking their calendars to avoid sin. The very act of intimacy, which should have been a source of closeness, was transformed into a complicated schedule of do's and don'ts. Guilt and fear could cloud even the most natural desires. In practice, many people likely broke the rules quietly, but doing so always carried the risk of confession, shame, and possible punishment. These bans reveal how deeply religion was woven into everyday life. The church was not content to rule over worship or belief. It sought to govern the body itself. Through calendars, sermons, and confessions, it claimed the power to say when love could happen and when it must wait. In this way, time itself became a form of control, with every week and every season marked by invisible boundaries. One of the most humiliating practices to modern eyes was the testing of a bride's purity. In several regions of Europe, particularly in the late Middle Ages, marriage contracts could be challenged if the bride was not believed to be a virgin. Families feared that an impure woman would bring shame, dishonor, or even divine punishment upon their household. To prove otherwise, some communities demanded a public display. After the wedding night, the sheets might be inspected by relatives or neighbors for proof of blood. In more extreme cases, midwives or older women were ordered to examine the bride before the marriage could even take place. The pressure this created was enormous. A young woman's reputation could be shattered in a single night, regardless of her true character. If the test did not satisfy the community, the marriage might be annulled, and she could be labeled as immoral for the rest of her life. The consequences stretched beyond the individual, as the honor of her entire family was thought to be at stake. Brothers, fathers, and mothers all carried the weight of her supposed virtue. In some places, legal documents even recorded disputes about a bride's condition. Courts could be called to decide whether a marriage was valid, turning a private matter into a public trial. For the woman involved, this meant standing before authority figures, while strangers discussed the most personal details of her body. The cruelty of such practices is clear today, but at the time, they were seen as necessary to protect inheritance, property rights, and family honor. These rituals remind us that intimacy in medieval Europe was never purely private. It was bound up with economics, status, and the fear of dishonor. The body of a bride was not seen as her own, but as a symbol of her family's reputation. In a world where survival often depended on alliances and social standing, this made her personal life a matter of public business. Another bizarre chapter in European history was the so-called impotence trial. In certain regions, if a wife claimed her husband could not fulfill his marital duties, the case could be taken to court. What followed was both humiliating and theatrical. The husband might be ordered to prove his ability in front of judges, priests, or even physicians. Sometimes this meant showing physical evidence of arousal on command, and in the most extreme cases, couples were forced to demonstrate intimacy in a chamber, while officials waited outside to hear the results. The underlying concern was not pleasure, but inheritance. Marriage was the foundation of property transfer and family alliances. If a man could not produce children, then land and titles might pass outside the family line. Wives, therefore, had legal grounds to demand annulment if their husband was proven incapable. The court wanted certainty, and the methods they used to gain it now seem shocking. Records from France in the 16th and 17th centuries describe doctors examining men in detail, noting size, shape, and physical reactions as if writing a medical report. Witnesses sometimes testified about whether they had seen signs of a man's weakness in daily life. For the accused, the shame was almost unbearable. A failed trial could mean not only the end of his marriage, but also public ridicule that might last a lifetime. Yet behind the cruelty lay the fear of disorder. A society built on inheritance needed to be sure of bloodlines. The inability of one man could ripple outward, destabilizing families, properties, and political ties. The impotence trial was not just about private matters, but about control over society's most basic structures. Today it reads like a spectacle of humiliation, but at the time it was considered a necessary safeguard against chaos. Looking back at these laws, it becomes clear that medieval Europe was not only a world of knights, castles, and faith, but also a place where intimate life was surrounded by suspicion and control. Rules about nakedness and hygiene, legends about the Lord's right to a bride, restrictions on positions, prohibitions tied to holy days, humiliating virginity tests, and the bizarre impotence trials all reveal the same truth. Private life was never truly private. The church, the crown, and the community all claimed the right to judge and punish what happened between husband and wife. To modern readers, these rules appear harsh, absurd, and at times even cruel. But to the people who lived under them, they were part of the rhythm of life, binding morality with survival. Authorities believed that by regulating desire, they could preserve order, protect inheritance, and guard the soul. In practice, they often created fear, humiliation, and injustice. These stories remind us that freedom in personal life has not always been guaranteed. It had to be won, little by little, across centuries of change. The strange and sometimes brutal laws of medieval Europe. stand today as a warning of how deeply institutions can reach into the human body and spirit when power and fear combine.